right now. Art Hogan, the chief strategist at Wunderlich Securities, and Rob Blackwell, the Washington bureau chief for American Banker. Good to see both you guys. You know, Art, you predicted bad things would happen should the Brexit actually materialize. They did. But today, they may be subsiding. Should people be getting back in at this level, or is there more pain to come?
We have more volatility come, I can tell you that, Trish. But I think that, you know, as markets will, we overshot. So in 2 days, we lost $3.6 trillion in global assets over something we have no answers to. So the process is what it's all about. The more answers we get, the more we find out, is Article 50 going to be delivered now, or is it September, or ever, and what that means. How will negotiations go? So right now, I think we're sort of working our way back to equilibrium. Think about the Dow being down 800 and back up 150 here. It's probably a more appropriate response. And I think, the more we learn, the worse this will seem. But right now, I think volatility is going to be the norm, not the exception for a period of time.
I mean, how bad is this really for us, Rob? I mean, one would have to assume the world is still going to trade with the UK. I mean, you might have an interim period as they work out these new trade deals that's challenging. But it's not as though people are suddenly saying, OK, I'm not going to do business in London anymore.
Well, that's true. And I think the impact in the U.S. is limited. You're going to see mortgage rates go down now because the Fed is not likely to raise interest rates. I do think there are impacts, obviously, globally in London. Some of the big banks in the U.S. are probably going to have to restructure a little bit. I don't mean to say that they would ignore London, but to disagree a little bit with Mr. Farage, I think a lot of big banks really do see London as a gateway to Europe, and that will now change, assuming that Britain goes through with this.
In what way? So suddenly bankers are packing up their suitcases and heading for Frankfurt? Or I made the comment earlier that, they certainly can't go to France because we know nobody works in France.
That's right. Good point. I think Frankfurt's a possibility. I mean, when you look at it, there was a memo from Jamie Dimon on Friday. He sent it out to his employees. There are about 4,000 employees there in the UK, and he said, look, we may need to make some changes here. We're still sorting it all out. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of debate.
Well, we know markets don't like uncertainty, right, Art Hogan?
Right.
So when does that uncertainty really start to catch up with the markets in a way that none of us like?
Well, I think part of it has. I mean, the largest reaction here is uncertainty. In and of itself, the UK leaving the Eurozone shouldn't cause as much turmoil in the world as the uncertainty is, are they the first of many? Does Italy raise their hand? Are they next? And I think that's the larger concern. If none of that comes to fruition, and believe me, I think the EU is going to make it an ugly divorce such that no one else wants to raise their hand and do this, we'll probably have smooth sailing. I think we need to have the Article 50.
Stop for a second, because that's important. You're saying the EU is going to make it such an ugly divorce that it's basically seen as an example of what not to do, thereby discouraging Italy, Portugal, Spain, all from potentially following suit. But what does that do to the UK in the interim?
Well, in the interim, it makes the negotiation process more difficult, right? They think they're just going to simply say, okay, we're walking away and let's just do business as usual. They're really going to have to fight for everything they get. The process will not be painless. But remember, these guys are important to each other. They're more important to each other than they are to us, right? So at the end of the day, they're going to, as you said at the beginning, they're going to continue to do trade, but they won't make the process look like it's easy. And I think that's and we won't know how that goes until the fall at the very least.
Well, the big question looming out there for everyone, right, is this a systemic triggering event? I mean, are you actually going to see a real problem in the banking system? I mean, certainly, you look at how they traded recently, the European banks, that was problematic. Is it going to be a problem such as what we saw in 2008, Rob?
It doesn't look like it right now. We haven't seen granted, things are volatile and the market doesn't like uncertainty, but U.S. banks have way more capital and liquidity than they did during 2008.
I don't mean U.S. banks. I mean actually the European banks. We were looking at the European debt crisis every summer, right, for the last 5 years, it seems. This thing brews up. I mean, just last summer you had Greece on the verge of total chaos there with people protesting in the street, throwing Molotov cocktails. And here we are coming up on this summer, and the UK is saying bye-bye. It just seems as though every year it is something, and so I wonder at what point can the European banks themselves not take it anymore? I mean, at what point do we reach a threshold when it suddenly turns into a systemic event?
Well, I agree. Obviously, when you're looking globally, European banks are in a more challenging environment. But you have to remember one of the big differences between the U.S. and in Europe is in the U.S. we don't want to prop up the banks. When we did in 2008, we bailed them out, but we don't want to do that anymore. Europe has culturally a lot less issues with bailing out the banks if it comes to it. They've tried to put in place some ways to prevent that from happening, but they're a lot less concerned about too big to fail than we are.
All right. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but thank you so
No,
much. Art and
both.
Rob, good to see you guys.